The sun was barely rising over the small mining town of Blackrock when Thomas Miller and his crew of 5 men prepared to enter the coal mine. It was a Tuesday morning in April, and the air still held the chill of early spring. Thomas had been working these mines for 15 years, and at 43, the black dust of coal had become a permanent part of his skin. "Another day, another dollar," said Rick, the youngest of the crew at 25, as he adjusted his helmet. The men nodded silently as they entered the elevator that would take them 800 feet below the surface. The familiar creaking and groaning of the old metal cage was almost comforting as they descended into darkness. Once at the bottom, they walked through the main tunnel, their headlamps cutting through the black air. Today, they were working in a new section of the mine. The company had discovered what they believed was a rich vein of coal extending east from the main shaft. Thomas and his crew were assigned to begin the excavation. "We'll start here," Thomas said, marking a spot on the tunnel wall with chalk. "Rick and Danny, you take the first shift with the drill. John and Pete, prepare the support beams. Mike, you're with me on the carts." The men moved with practiced efficiency. The sound of the drill filled the tunnel as Rick and Danny began boring into the rock face. The work was hard but routine. For 3 hours, they made steady progress, the pile of coal and rock growing behind them. Then something strange happened. "Hey, boss!" Rick called out, his voice echoing in the tunnel. "Something's not right here." Thomas walked over to the drill site. The drill bit had broken through what should have been solid rock into what seemed to be an empty space. "Stop the drill," Thomas ordered. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The men gathered around as Rick carefully removed the drill. They widened the opening by hand, chipping away at the rock until they had created a hole large enough to shine their lights through. "What is that?" Danny whispered. Their headlamps revealed what appeared to be a small natural cave beyond the rock wall. But what caught their attention was not the cave itself, it was what sat in the middle of it. "Is that a coffin?" John asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Indeed, sitting on the cave floor was what looked like a wooden box, approximately 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. Despite being surrounded by rock and earth, it showed no signs of crushing or decay. It was clearly man-made, with smooth sides and what appeared to be carvings on its surface. "This doesn't make any sense," Thomas said, rubbing his dust-covered face. "We're 800 feet underground. How could a coffin be here?" "Maybe it's not a coffin," Mike suggested. "Could be an old storage box or something." Thomas shook his head. "No, that's a coffin, all right. I've seen enough of them in my life to know." The men fell silent, each wondering how such a thing could exist so deep in the earth, untouched by time or the crushing weight of rock. "We need to report this," Thomas finally said, reaching for his radio. "Nobody touches it until the bosses decide what to do." As Thomas called it in, the other miners stared at the wooden box. The carvings on its surface seemed to catch the light in strange ways, creating patterns that appeared to shift and move. "Hey, did you see that?" Rick whispered to Danny. "I swear I just saw one of those carvings move." Danny nodded slowly, his face pale beneath the coal dust. "Something's not right about this. Not right at all." None of them knew it yet, but their discovery was about to change everything, not just for them, but for the entire world. Word of the strange discovery spread quickly through the Blackrock Mining Company. By noon, the tunnel leading to the mysterious coffin was filled with people. The mine manager, Harold Wilson, arrived first, his face tight with concern. "Nobody touches anything until we get some experts in here," Harold ordered, taking photos with his phone. He had called the county sheriff and the State Historical Society right away. Thomas and his crew sat on some rocks nearby, drinking coffee from their thermoses. They watched as more people arrived. Company officials in clean helmets and pressed shirts, looking out of place in the dusty tunnel. "What do you think is in it?" Rick asked, his voice low. "Could be anything," Thomas replied. "Or nothing. Might have been emptied long ago." "But how did it get down here?" Danny wondered. "That's what I can't figure out." By 2 o'clock, Sheriff Martinez arrived with 2 deputies. Shortly after, a woman in hiking boots and a jacket too light for the mine's chill stepped out of the elevator. She carried a large bag over her shoulder. "Dr. Sarah Collins," she introduced herself, shaking Harold's hand. "State Archaeological Department. I came as quickly as I could." Dr. Collins approached the hole in the wall, shining her flashlight through. Her eyes widened as she saw the coffin. Extraordinary, she whispered. This shouldn't be possible. She turned to Thomas and his crew. Who found this? We all did, Thomas said. We were drilling and broke through into that cave. Dr. Collins nodded, taking notes. And you're certain no one has disturbed it? No one's touched it, Harold assured her. We've been waiting for you. Dr. Collins spent the next hour examining the opening, taking samples of the surrounding rock, and photographing everything. Finally, she made a decision. We need to widen this opening, she said. I need to get in there and examine the coffin properly. It took nearly 2 more hours of careful work to make the hole big enough for a person to climb through. Dr. Collins insisted on going first, followed by Sheriff Martinez. Thomas, as the crew leader, was allowed to join them. Inside the small cave, the air felt different, strangely dry and still. The coffin sat on a flat section of the cave floor, as if placed there deliberately. Up close, Thomas could see that the carvings were more complex than they had first appeared. They weren't pictures exactly, but intricate patterns that seemed to flow across the wood. These markings, Dr. Collins said, touching them gently. I've never seen anything like them. They're not consistent with any burial practices I know of from this region. Sheriff Martinez frowned. How old do you think this thing is? It's impossible to say without proper testing, Dr. Collins replied, but the preservation is remarkable. The wood should have rotted away in these conditions. It doesn't make sense. She took more photos and careful measurements. Thomas noticed that she avoided touching the coffin more than necessary. Are you going to open it? He asked. Dr. Collins hesitated. Not yet. We need more equipment and proper documentation. This is a significant find, potentially historically important. We need to do this right. As they finished their initial examination, a strange sound came from the coffin, a soft, low hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. All 3 froze. Did you hear that? Thomas whispered. Dr. Collins nodded slowly, her face pale in the light of their headlamps. It's probably just air escaping, Sheriff Martinez suggested. These old coffins sometimes seal up tight. But Thomas noticed that the sheriff's hand had moved to rest on his gun. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the cave silent again. But something had changed. The air felt charged somehow, like before a lightning storm. I think we should leave now, Dr. Collins said quietly. I need to make some calls. This requires specialized equipment. As they climbed back through the opening, Thomas glanced back at the coffin. For just a moment, he thought he saw one of the carvings glow with a faint blue light. He decided not to mention it to the others. Some things were too strange to put into words. The next morning, the mine was closed to regular operations. A white tent had been set up around the cave entrance, and a team of experts had arrived before dawn. Dr. Collins had called in specialists from the State University, Dr. James Chen, an expert in ancient artifacts, and Dr. Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in unusual burial practices. Thomas and Rick were the only miners allowed to stay. The company had chosen them as representatives since they were the first to discover the coffin. I couldn't sleep at all last night, Rick whispered to Thomas as they watched the experts set up their equipment. Kept thinking about that thing down here all by itself for who knows how long. Thomas nodded. He hadn't slept well either, but for different reasons. The blue glow he'd seen had visited his dreams, along with strange symbols that seemed to float in the darkness behind his closed eyes. Inside the tent, the scientists worked methodically. They had brought in lights, cameras, and various testing devices. Dr. Chen moved the handheld scanner slowly over the coffin's surface. The wood appears to be oak, he announced, but the readings are unusual. The density is much higher than it should be. Dr. Rodriguez carefully examined the carvings. Some of these symbols have elements that resemble ancient Sumerian script, but others are completely unknown to me. Dr. Collins looked troubled. Are we ready to open it? The sheriff needs to know our timeline. Sheriff Martinez stood nearby, accompanied today by 4 deputies instead of 2. Thomas noticed they all wore their sidearms, which seemed strange for what was supposed to be a scientific investigation. We documented everything thoroughly, Dr. Chen said. I believe we're ready. The tent fell silent. Everyone moved back slightly as Dr. Collins and Dr. Chen positioned themselves on either side of the coffin. We'll lift on 3, Dr. Collins said, placing her gloved hands on one side of the lid. 1, 2, 3. The lid rose more easily than expected, as if perfectly balanced. Thomas held his breath as the scientists carefully set it aside. For a moment, no one spoke. Then gasps filled the tent. Inside the coffin lay not a body, but a collection of objects arranged in a precise pattern. In the center was a metal disc about the size of a dinner plate, covered with the same strange symbols that adorned the outside of the coffin. Around it were arranged 7 crystal-like stones, each a different color, forming a perfect circle. But what drew everyone's attention was the small metal box at the head of the coffin. It was made of a silvery material that gleamed under the lights, unmarked except for a single circular depression on its top. This is not what I expected," Dr. Collins said, her voice unsteady. Dr. Chen reached for the metal disc, but Dr. Rodriguez caught his wrist. "Wait. We should document the positioning first." As they photographed the contents, Sheriff Martinez stepped closer. "What exactly are we looking at here? Is this some kind of time capsule?" "I don't know," Dr. Collins admitted. "I've never seen anything like this." Rick leaned toward Thomas. "That doesn't look like any burial I've ever heard of." Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the small metal box. Something about it seemed to pull at him, like a magnet drawing his attention. Dr. Chen carefully lifted the metal disc. As soon as it moved, the 7 crystals began to glow softly, each emitting light of its own color: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. "That's impossible," Dr. Rodriguez whispered. "There's no power source." The glow intensified, and a low humming filled the tent. The same sound Thomas had heard the day before. The air seemed to vibrate around them. Sheriff Martinez put his hand on his gun. "Maybe we should step back and—" Before he could finish, the small metal box at the head of the coffin clicked open on its own. The lid slid back smoothly, revealing what was inside. Thomas stared in disbelief. There, nestled in the box, was a single sheet of paper, and on it, written in clear, modern handwriting, were words that made his blood run cold. "Thomas Miller, Richard Davis, we've been waiting for you." Their full names. Names that no one had spoken since they'd entered the mine. The tent fell silent. Every eye turned to Thomas and Rick, who stood frozen in shock. "How is this possible?" Dr. Collins whispered, looking from the paper to the 2 miners. Sheriff Martinez moved quickly, ushering the scientists back. "Everyone step away from that thing. Now." His hand remained firmly on his gun as he approached the coffin. Thomas couldn't move. His name, his full name, written inside a coffin that had been sealed away deep underground. It made no sense. "This has to be some kind of prank," Rick said, his voice shaking. "Someone's messing with us." Dr. Chen shook his head. "That's impossible. This chamber was completely sealed until yesterday, and the dating tests we ran confirm the wood is at least 200 years old." Sheriff Martinez carefully picked up the paper using tweezers and placed it in a clear evidence bag. "We need to examine this, and I want to know who had access to this site since yesterday." "Only the people in this room, plus a few security guards," Harold, the mine manager, assured him. "And the entrance has been monitored continuously." Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer to examine the rest of the coffin's contents. The 7 crystals continued to glow softly, casting colored light across her face. "We should collect these for analysis," she said, reaching for the red crystal. "Wait!" Thomas suddenly called out. Something deep inside him screamed that touching those stones was dangerous. "I don't think we should move anything else until we understand what's happening." Sheriff Martinez nodded in agreement. "He's right. Let's secure the site and get some additional experts in here." As they debated what to do next, Thomas noticed something odd about the metal disc Dr. Chen had moved. From his angle, he could see that the underside was covered not with strange symbols, but with what looked like a map. He stepped closer. "Dr. Chen, could you turn that disc over, please?" The scientist carefully flipped the metal disc. Everyone gathered around to look. It was indeed a map, a detailed layout of tunnels and chambers that looked strikingly similar to the Blackrock mine. But there were additional tunnels shown that Thomas had never seen before, extending far beyond the known mine system. "That's our mine," Harold said in disbelief. "But these sections here, they don't exist." Thomas studied the map carefully. Some of these match expansion plans that were just approved last month. Projects that haven't even started yet. Dr. Collins looked up sharply. That's not possible. If this coffin is as old as we think, then whoever made it knew about mining plans that wouldn't exist for 2 centuries, Dr. Chen finished. The implications hung in the air, too strange for anyone to voice aloud. Sheriff Martinez took control of the situation. All right, here's what's going to happen. This site is now restricted. No one comes in or out without my direct approval. Dr. Collins, I want all your findings so far. Mr. Wilson, I need a complete list of everyone who knew about those expansion plans. As the sheriff gave orders, Thomas found his eyes drawn back to the small metal box. The note with their names had been taken away, but the box remained. Something about its smooth, silvery surface bothered him. It didn't look old. It didn't look like it belonged with the other artifacts. Look at this, he said quietly to Rick, pointing to the circular depression on the box's lid. Doesn't that look like a fingerprint scanner? Rick finished, eyes widening. Like on our phones. Before anyone could stop him, Thomas reached out and placed his thumb on the circular depression. The effect was immediate. All 7 crystals flared with brilliant light, nearly blinding everyone in the tent. A humming sound returned, louder than before, vibrating through their bodies. And then, from somewhere deep within the coffin, came a voice, mechanical and strange, but clearly speaking English. Identity confirmed. Thomas Miller. Initiating temporal message sequence. The metal disc began to spin in Dr. Chen's hands, the symbols on its surface blurring into a circle of light. Sheriff Martinez drew his gun. Everybody out. Now. But Thomas couldn't move. As the others rushed toward the exit, he stood transfixed by the spinning disc, certain that whatever was happening was meant specifically for him. Chaos erupted inside the tent. Sheriff Martinez was shouting orders as his deputies tried to evacuate everyone. Dr. Collins stumbled backward. Only Thomas remained still, his eyes fixed on the spinning disc. Thomas, come on. Rick grabbed his arm, trying to pull him away. But Thomas couldn't move. The humming grew louder, and the spinning disc began to project beams of colored light that danced across the cave walls. The mechanical voice spoke again. Message prepared for Thomas Miller, born March 17, 1979, third-generation miner, father of Emily and Jason. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Those were his children's names, information no one in the mine knew. How does it know that? Rick whispered, his grip on Thomas's arm loosening in shock. The spinning disc suddenly stopped, and the light beams converged to form what looked like a hologram, a 3-dimensional image of a man standing above the coffin. The figure was dressed in strange clothing that seemed both modern and old-fashioned at once. His face was partially obscured by a beard, but his eyes were clear and startlingly blue. Hello, Thomas, the hologram said. My name is Dr. William Ellis. You don't know me, but I know you. I was born in the year 2087. Sheriff Martinez, who had returned to grab Thomas, froze at these words. What you found is not a coffin, but a time capsule, one designed to survive centuries underground until the precise moment you discovered it, the hologram continued. I know this is difficult to believe, but in my time, we developed limited means of sending information backward through time. Dr. Collins had crept back into the tent and was recording everything on her phone, her hands shaking. We can't send people or large objects. The energy requirements are too great. But we can send small items and encoded messages, like this one, the hologram explained. We spent years researching the best location and time to place this capsule, and you, Thomas Miller, are the reason we chose this spot. Thomas felt his knees weaken. Rick helped him sit down on a nearby crate. In my time, you are remembered as the man who made a discovery that changed human history. The problem is that discovery doesn't happen naturally. We needed to make sure you found what you were supposed to find. The hologram gestured, and the image changed to show what looked like a small crystal, similar to the ones in the coffin, but larger and clear instead of colored. 300 feet directly below where you're standing right now is a mineral deposit unlike any currently known to your scientists. We call it temporite. It's the key element that makes our time communication possible. In your time, it will revolutionize energy production, medicine, and eventually lead to the technology I'm using to speak to you now. Sheriff Martinez holstered his gun and approached slowly. This has to be some kind of trick, he muttered. The hologram seemed to respond. though it clearly couldn't hear them. This is not a trick or a prank. The 7 crystals in this container are small samples of refined temperate. Your scientists can study them to verify what I'm telling you. They'll find atomic structures that don't match any known element in your periodic table. Thomas finally found his voice. Why me? Why not just tell the mining company directly? Almost as if answering him, the hologram continued, You were chosen, Thomas, because historical records show you were a man of integrity. When the mining company tried to cover up this discovery to exploit it privately, you were the one who made sure the world knew. That decision cost you your job, but it gave humanity a gift that changed everything. Thomas exchanged a shocked glance with Rick. A hologram of Dr. Ellis smiled sadly. The instructions for finding the main deposit are encoded in the metal disc. The crystals will help your scientists understand what they're looking at. And Thomas, the small box contains something personal for you. A thank you gift from the future. The hologram began to fade, the voice becoming distorted. One last thing, be careful who you trust with this knowledge. Not everyone wants this technology shared with the world. Some people will. The image flickered and disappeared before the sentence could be completed. The humming stopped. The lights from the crystals dimmed to a soft glow. The cave fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing. Everyone stared at Thomas, who sat with his head in his hands, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Did that really just happen? Dr. Chen whispered. Thomas looked up at the coffin, then at the small metal box that supposedly contained a gift from the future. What do we do now? Rick asked, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps approaching the tent. Harold had returned, and he wasn't alone. Harold entered the tent with 3 men in black suits. They didn't look like miners or scientists. Their clean appearance and serious faces marked them as outsiders. The tallest one, a man with gray hair and sharp eyes, stepped forward. I'm Agent Wilson from the Department of Energy, he said, showing a badge quickly before returning it to his pocket. This site is now under federal jurisdiction. Sheriff Martinez moved to block his path. I wasn't informed of any federal involvement. This is still my investigation. Agent Wilson smiled thinly. Not anymore, Sheriff. National security concerns take priority. I need everyone to clear the area immediately. Thomas noticed how quickly these agents had arrived. Too quickly. They must have already been nearby, perhaps even waiting for something like this to happen. Dr. Collins stepped forward. We're in the middle of cataloging important archaeological finds. You can't just shut us down without. We can and we will, interrupted one of the other agents, a younger man with a military-style haircut. Everyone needs to hand over any recordings, samples, or notes you've taken, then leave the premises. Thomas remembered the hologram's warning about trusting the wrong people. He glanced at the small metal box still sitting in the coffin. Whatever personal message it contained for him, he couldn't let these men take it. While everyone was arguing with the agents, Thomas slowly moved closer to the coffin. Rick noticed and positioned himself to block the agent's view. This is completely irregular, Dr. Chen was saying loudly. We need proper documentation of chain of custody for these artifacts. Thomas quickly reached into the coffin and slipped the small metal box into his pocket. It was surprisingly warm to the touch. No one seemed to notice except Rick, who gave him a slight nod. Agent Wilson was losing patience. This isn't a request. It's an order. You'd have 5 minutes to gather your personal belongings. Everything else stays. Dr. Rodriguez pointed at the crystals. These could be radioactive or biohazardous. We need to run proper tests before. We have specialists for that. Agent Wilson cut her off. 4 minutes now. Sheriff Martinez stepped closer to Thomas and whispered, Something's not right here. These guys arrived too fast. Thomas nodded slightly. The message warned me about people wanting to keep this technology for themselves. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. You actually believe that hologram thing? I don't know what to believe, Thomas admitted. But I know my kids' names weren't public information. One of the agents was now photographing the coffin contents. Another was speaking quietly into a radio, requesting a containment team. Harold, the mine manager, looked nervous. Everyone, please follow the agent's instructions. The company doesn't want any trouble with the federal government. As the scientists reluctantly packed their personal items, Agent Wilson approached Thomas directly. Mr. Miller, I understand you interacted with some kind of projection device. I'll need a complete statement from you. Thomas tried to keep his face neutral. I just saw some lights and heard a voice. I don't know what it meant. The agent studied him closely. We'll need you to come with us for debriefing. Sheriff Martinez intervened. If you're taking any of my citizens in for questioning, I'm coming along. That's non-negotiable. Agent Wilson seemed about to argue, then nodded curtly. Fine, Mr. Miller and Sheriff Martinez will accompany us. Everyone else is free to go after surrendering any data collected here. As they were escorted out of the tent, Thomas felt the box in his pocket grow warmer. He caught Rick's eye and mouthed, "Tell my wife." Rick nodded slightly, understanding that Thomas wanted his family to know what was happening. Outside, more government vehicles had arrived. Men in hazmat suits were preparing to enter the mine. Thomas noticed they were carrying equipment that looked far more advanced than what the scientists had been using. "Mr. Miller, this way please," Agent Wilson said, directing him toward a black SUV. As Thomas walked toward the vehicle, he felt the box in his pocket pulse once, like a heartbeat. Whatever was inside, he had a feeling it was more than just a message. The future had sent him something important, something these agents would take away if they knew about it. He climbed into the back of the SUV, with Sheriff Martinez following close behind. As the doors closed, Thomas wondered if he would ever see the mine or his family again. The black SUV drove along winding mountain roads, taking Thomas and Sheriff Martinez away from the mine. Agent Wilson sat in the front passenger seat while another agent drove. No one spoke. Thomas could feel the metal box growing increasingly warm in his pocket. They had been driving for nearly 20 minutes when Sheriff Martinez broke the silence. "Where exactly are you taking us?" he asked. "My family will be worried," Thomas said. "Phones later," Agent Wilson said. "We need to maintain communication security until we understand what we're dealing with." The box in Thomas's pocket suddenly grew hot. Not enough to burn, but impossible to ignore. He shifted uncomfortably, trying not to draw attention to it. As he moved, his fingers brushed against the circular depression on the box's surface. Immediately, the SUV's engine sputtered and died. All the dashboard lights went out at once. "What the?" the driver exclaimed, fighting with the steering wheel as the vehicle rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the road. Agent Wilson grabbed his radio. "Team 2, we have a vehicle malfunction." The radio produced only static. He tried his cell phone next. "No signal. Check yours." As the agents frantically tried to restore communications, Sheriff Martinez leaned close to Thomas. "Did you do something?" he whispered. Thomas shook his head slightly, just as confused as everyone else. The box in his pocket was now pulsing with heat in a steady rhythm. The driver turned the key repeatedly, but the engine wouldn't start. "It's like the battery's completely dead." "Pop the hood," Agent Wilson ordered, opening his door. "You two, stay here," he added, pointing at Thomas and the sheriff. Both agents exited the vehicle to check the engine. As soon as they were outside, Sheriff Martinez whispered urgently, "Something's not right. These aren't normal government protocols. We need tow." The locks on all doors suddenly clicked open. The box in Thomas's pocket gave one final, strong pulse of heat, then cooled. Thomas and the sheriff exchanged shocked looks. "Run," Thomas said simply. They shoved their doors open and bolted into the thick forest alongside the road. Behind them, they heard Agent Wilson shouting, followed by the sound of a gun being drawn from a holster. "Stop immediately," the agent yelled. Thomas and Sheriff Martinez sprinted between trees, using the thick trunks for cover. A gunshot rang out, splintering bark from a tree near Thomas's head. "They're shooting at us," the sheriff gasped. "Federal agents don't shoot at unarmed civilians." "I don't think they're real agents," Thomas panted as they ran deeper into the woods. They ran for what felt like miles, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Eventually, they stopped in a small clearing to catch their breath. "We need to get back to town," Sheriff Martinez said between heavy breaths. "I need to contact my deputies." Thomas nodded, pulling out the metal box. "I think this thing helped us somehow. It got hot right before the car died." The sheriff stared at it. "That's impossible." "About as impossible as a hologram from the future," Thomas replied. He examined the box carefully. The circular depression on top seemed to glow faintly. Acting on instinct, Thomas pressed his thumb against it again. The box clicked open, revealing its contents. Inside was a small device that looked like a sleek, metallic compass. Instead of pointing north, its needle spun briefly before pointing steadily in a specific direction, away from the road, deeper into the forest. Also in the box was a small piece of paper. Thomas unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the handwritten message aloud. Thomas, when you need it most, the compass will lead you to safety. People who call themselves agents want the temperate for themselves. They've been searching for it for years. Get to Daniel Carter at Westlake University. He'll help you prove what you found. The future depends on you sharing this discovery with the world, not letting it fall into the hands of those who would use it for power. Trust the compass. Dr. Ellis. Sheriff Martinez ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. We should head back to the road and flag down a passing car. Thomas looked at the compass, its needle unwavering in its direction. The message warned us these people aren't who they claim to be. I think we should follow this. Follow a magic compass from the future into unknown wilderness. That's your plan? As if in answer, they heard voices in the distance. The agents had picked up their trail again. Thomas pointed in the direction the compass indicated. You have a better idea? The sheriff sighed, checking his empty holster where his gun should have been. Lead the way, but I hope your future friend knows what he's doing. They set off through the forest, following the compass, as the sounds of pursuit grew closer behind them. Thomas and Sheriff Martinez followed the compass through the dense forest for hours. The sun began to set, casting long shadows between the trees. They were tired, hungry, and worried about the agents who might still be following them. We need to find shelter soon, Sheriff Martinez said, looking at the darkening sky. Just as he spoke, the compass needle began to spin wildly. Then it stopped, pointing directly at a small cabin hidden among the trees. The building looked old but well-maintained, with smoke rising from its chimney. Someone's home, Thomas whispered. Should we trust it? I've been expecting you, Thomas Miller called out. Dr. Ellis told me you'd come. Thomas and the sheriff exchanged shocked glances. Who are you? Sheriff Martinez demanded, stepping forward protectively. My name is Daniel Carter, the man replied. The same Daniel Carter mentioned in your note. I'm a professor at Westlake University, or I was, until I disappeared 5 years ago. Thomas pulled out the note and checked it. It does say Daniel Carter, but how did you know we were coming today? The old man smiled. Come inside. It's not safe out here after dark. I have much to explain. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. Professor Carter gave them food and water while they sat around a small table. On the walls hung charts of stars and complex equations Thomas didn't understand. 20 years ago, Carter began, I discovered unusual energy readings in these mountains. When I investigated, I found small crystals similar to what you discovered today. I was studying them when men claiming to be government agents confiscated my research and threatened my family. The same men who are after us now? Sheriff Martinez asked. Carter nodded. They call themselves the Kronos Group. They're a private organization that has infiltrated parts of the government. They've been searching for temperate for decades. But what is temperate exactly? Thomas asked. It's a mineral that can interact with time itself, Carter explained, taking out a small clear crystal from his pocket, identical to the one shown in the hologram. It stores energy in a way that defies our understanding of physics. With enough temperate, you could theoretically send information backward through time. Thomas leaned forward. So the message from the future was real. Very real, Carter confirmed. 3 years ago, I received a visitor, a young scientist who knew things about my research that no one could know. He gave me technical designs beyond anything I'd ever seen. Together, we built a small device capable of receiving messages from the future. Carter walked to a cabinet and pulled out a machine that looked similar to the disc from the Coffin. 2 weeks ago, we received a message about you, Thomas, and instructions on where to find you after your discovery. Dr. Ellis from 2087 has been working with us across time. Sheriff Martinez shook his head in disbelief. This is impossible. Yet here you are, led by a compass that shouldn't exist, Carter replied calmly. Thomas took out the compass. So what do we do now? Those Kronos people are still after us. Tomorrow morning, we leave for my secret lab at Westlake University. There, we have evidence compiled from multiple time messages, enough to prove everything to the world. Once the discovery goes public, it will be too dangerous for the Kronos group to act against us. Outside, a twig snapped in the darkness. Carter immediately turned off the lights. They found us, he whispered. Thomas looked at the compass in his hand. Its needle was spinning rapidly, as if warning of danger. Then suddenly, it stopped, pointing to a small trapdoor hidden under a rug. This way, Carter said, opening the door to reveal a tunnel. This leads to an old mining shaft. We can escape through there. As they climbed down, Thomas heard vehicles approaching the cabin. What about all your research? He asked Carter. The old professor smiled. Already packed and waiting at the other end of the tunnel. Dr. Ellis warned me this might happen. They moved quickly through the narrow passage, guided by the light of Carter's lantern. Behind them, they heard the cabin door being broken down. Thomas, Carter said as they hurried through the darkness, do you understand now why you were chosen? In the future that Dr. Ellis comes from, you were the one who revealed temperate to the world. You made sure it wasn't monopolized by people like the Kronos group. You changed history. Thomas thought of his children, of the world they would inherit. And I'll do it again, he promised. As they emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air, Thomas saw the stars shining brightly overhead. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of a helicopter approaching. The compass in his hand warmed slightly, its needle pointing confidently forward toward the future that was waiting for them all.